We want to bring in right now Nicole DeBoard, criminal defense attorney there as well, trial lawyer. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. Of course, we're just learning more information about these 34 felony counts against the former president. What's the biggest takeaway for you from what we're learning today?
Well, I think that we all thought prior to this day that these were going to be largely misdemeanor accusations. And so to see the indictment unsealed and see that it is instead largely felony accusations has been sort of the biggest surprise or the biggest takeaway from what I've learned from the unsealing from the indictment.
And obviously, you just heard from Alvin Bragg there, the DA in Manhattan. Quite a few questions, not necessarily a short press conference. He talks about the key lie, as he called it, in those 34 documents, or the 34 catch and kill scheme. Give me a breakdown of kind of what that means. What does catch and kill mean in terms of prosecution and what he was entailing in this indictment?
So what it sounds like he's alleging through the indictment is that basically the overall plan was to catch any information which would have negatively impacted the Trump campaign and to kill that story or kill that information. And so what it sounds like the allegations are about, as we're just now all learning them together, is that each of these separate 34 counts are documents wherein they're saying there were things said or put down on paper that were not true, according to the prosecution, and that these things were all designed to further the plan to catch information that the campaign did not want out there during the election and to kill that information so that it would not be a problem for campaign purposes.
And you also heard questions, as we just saw former President Trump there walking out of the courtroom from about an hour ago, as he's already on his way back there to Florida. He's expected to make some remarks in Mar-a-Lago. And we also saw him there as well. There is no gag order put in place. Are we surprised by that? Is that commonplace? And kind of what's our reaction to that? Because obviously he has a speech tonight. Later on, about 8:15 is expected to start. No gag order in place. Is that surprising to you? Is that common? What's your take on that?
Well, gag orders are always less common. The idea is that we all have the right to have information about what's happening in the courtroom. The public filings are available to us all to talk about and consider, as are the courtroom proceedings. And judges are generally reluctant to gag the parties from talking about things that are normally a part of the public record, things that the public wants to learn about and hear about. But what the judge did admonish the parties is that he expected them not to be offering incendiary comments or things that would somehow impact ultimately the ability of former President Trump to get a fair day in trial, if that is the direction that this court case ultimately takes.
This is certainly some unprecedented times as we're looking at Mar-a-Lago as well. And you were talking about the gag order, not necessarily common, but also this is far from common, what we're witnessing right here as the unprecedented case moving forward. We also know that potentially 8 months from now, there will be more proceedings. Does the timeline kind of fit for you? I mean, we're not going to be back in court again for several months. Is that common as well?
I'm not sure about how common that long of a, what we would call in the criminal court world, a reset would be, but practically speaking, it makes sense. There is no reason to have former President Trump come to court repeatedly while the parties argue about various discovery issues. And as they try to sort out things that need to be really resolved, at least in terms of what are we going to be fighting about when we do go back to court, that should all happen without him having to go to court, or any defendant for that matter, having to go to court needlessly and waste time and precious court resources.
Discovery is something that I think a lot of people are going to talk about, because this is the point where kind of the prosecutors kind of turn over all the information they have to the defense as well. It didn't feel like there was a ton of new information that maybe Trump's party didn't already have. Would that be fair to say?
It's hard to tell. We know what the allegations are specifically now, and so does the Trump team. So they are now aware of exactly what statutes are in play, what laws they need to be looking at, and what kinds of information they need to be digging for and trying to do their own investigation to gather. So I think that this is really just the starting line, and both sides now, the prosecution will be doing what they should be doing, which is to turn over the necessary discovery as it's required by law for them to do. And the Trump team will not only be receiving that information, but also conducting their own independent investigation of the case so that they can mount a proper defense.
Correct, and it is important to point out that obviously Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg bringing it forward, but also was part of a grand jury, so certainly some interesting notes there. I did find one of the questions asked by one of the reporters mentioning the fact that there really hasn't been they haven't moved forward with an indictment previous district attorneys, and they asked Alvin Bragg if there was some sort of new information. Does that lead you to believe that there maybe was some from the previous two district attorneys, or potentially not?
It is very possible that there was, and really, as you've already pointed out, the grand jury was guiding this investigation. So a prosecutor can go out and get things that the grand jurors are requesting and bring them to the grand jury for the grand jury to consider. But once a case is before the grand jury is really who directs that investigation. And it is possible that as time went on, the case evolved and additional information was collected that perhaps former prosecutors and or grand jurors didn't have access to, or that they viewed in a different light.
And of course, obviously following this, Nicole DeBoard, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox. I think a lot of people are just kind of trying to wrap their heads around this whole ordeal. What is next? Obviously, you mentioned the long recess, but there's going to be a lot of processes within the legal battles between the two sides. Kind of what's next in the process following this arraignment?
Well, you can bet that the Trump team will be rolling up their sleeves and digging through just copious amounts of information, both that they're gathering on their own and that they're being given by the state. And then what they're going to need to do is evaluate what types of motions do they need to file to protect former President Trump in terms of his constitutional rights as this criminal case proceeds. So they've got a lot of work ahead, and I expect there will be some long hours as they go through all of these materials.
And speaking of motions, kind of what type of motions may be happening? Will it be appeal? Kind of give us a little bit of breakdown of the motions that potentially could come into play in a case like this.
Well, the very first thing this legal team will be doing, I would imagine, is taking a very close look at the pleading, and that means the indictment itself. The way that the language was used and the statutes that were cited, does this comport with what the Constitution requires and what case law requires? And if they feel there are deviations from what the law mandates be in an indictment, or constitutional problems with the charges as the way they are raised, you can expect that the lawyers will be working hard to put together motions to have the judge rule on whether or not this indictment can proceed as it is written.
Certainly a lot of information still coming out about this. He's expected to speak at Mar-a-Lago later on tonight, and potentially he's going to discuss this matter in front of the people down there, a lot of staunch supporters of them. We saw them in New York. We saw them as he departed yesterday from Florida. Potentially, if he says something, can the judge go back and put in a gag order or something like that? Or will they be paying attention to something he says both on social media and to media and the public during a very public presidential campaign?
Oh, absolutely. And I can tell you, as a defense lawyer, the scariest thing that you can watch is a client, someone who is accused of a crime with serious consequences like this one, make any kind of statement that could later be attributed to them. And so, you know, it's a fine line. On the one hand, he wants to make sure that his supporters have information. On the other hand, I can guarantee the lawyers will be biting their nails, making sure that nothing that he says can ultimately be used against him in court. Yeah, it is
got to be a tough spot for the lawyers there to both let Donald Trump be himself, but also make sure that he doesn't put jeopardy this case as well. Nicole DeBoard, any parting words before I let you go on this case, or anything else you can come to mind that our audience should know about it?
I think that we can expect a long road. I think this first 8-month reset will be just the first. And I think that we'll see a lot of complicated emotions, and we'll hear a lot more about what the state has charged and the legal issues surrounding these statutes and the way it's being applied here.
Definitely. Certainly an unprecedented time, a historical time. Nicole DeBoard, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox to give some legal perspective into this case that we saw in arraignment earlier. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.